The North Atlantic is black and restless. Winter presses down on the sea, January winds tearing white scars across the waves. Somewhere between Greenland and Ireland, a single British warship cuts forward through the darkness, her bow rising and falling with mechanical patience. There are no lights on deck. Only the low hum of engines, the creak of steel, and the steady rhythm of men waiting at their stations. Below the surface, the ocean feels different. Sound travels farther here. Every vibration matters. In the operations room, a faint echo blooms on the screen. Then another. The sonar operator does not speak at first. He tightens his grip. This is not chance contact. This is pursuit. Depth charges are armed, rolled into position with deliberate care. The ship does not rush. She slows, listens, and listens again. Somewhere beneath them, a German U-boat commander realizes he is no longer hunting. He is being hunted. Across the Atlantic, hundreds of merchant ships have already vanished into cold water. Thousands of sailors are gone. For 2 years, the ocean has belonged to the submarines. But tonight, in this narrow patch of sea, something has changed. One British ship is about to turn the silence itself into a weapon, and the Atlantic will never feel safe again. If this moment stayed with you, comment below, like, and subscribe for more true World War II stories. By the opening months of 1942, the Atlantic Ocean had become the most decisive battlefield of the Second World War. It was not marked by front lines or trenches, but by shipping lanes that stretched from North America to Britain and onward to the Soviet Union. Along these routes flowed food, fuel, troops, and raw materials. Without them, Britain could not fight. Without them, the war would end not with a decisive battle, but with slow starvation. German naval planners understood this from the beginning. Long before tanks crossed borders in Europe, Admiral Karl Donitz had already identified the Atlantic as the place where the war could truly be won. The German U-boat arm entered the conflict with a clear strategic vision. Submarines would not engage enemy warships in decisive fleet battles. Instead, they would attack the arteries of Allied logistics. Merchant ships, often lightly defended and slow-moving, became the primary targets. Donitz believed that if enough tonnage could be sunk each month, Britain's economy would collapse. This was not a theory born of desperation, but one refined through bitter experience in the First World War. Now, with improved submarine designs and trained crews, Germany intended to finish what it had started a generation earlier. In the early years of the war, the results were devastating. German submarines operated with increasing confidence across vast areas of the Atlantic. They exploited gaps in Allied convoy coverage, particularly in the mid-Atlantic air gap, where land-based aircraft could not reach. At night, U-boats surfaced and attacked from close range, using their speed and low silhouette to strike before escorts could respond. Wolfpack tactics allowed multiple submarines to converge on convoys, overwhelming defenses through coordination and persistence. For Allied sailors, the ocean became a place of constant dread. Ships were hit without warning, often exploding or breaking apart in seconds. British and Allied anti-submarine warfare lagged behind the threat. Early sonar systems, known as ASTIC, could detect submarines under ideal conditions, but were unreliable in rough seas and lost contact when a ship passed directly over a target. Depth charges required precise estimation of a submarine's depth and position, and many attacks were based on little more than educated guesswork. Escort vessels were too few, too lightly armed, and too focused on staying close to convoys to pursue fleeing submarines. The doctrine was defensive, cautious, and reactive. U-boats learned that if they could survive the first attack, escape was often possible. The human cost of this imbalance mounted rapidly. In 1941 alone, millions of tons of Allied shipping were sunk. Crews drowned in freezing water, often within minutes. Survivors clung to rafts for days if they were lucky. The psychological strain on merchant sailors and naval escorts alike was immense. Every horizon line seemed to hide a periscope. Every unexplained sound raised alarm. The Atlantic was not simply a supply route anymore. It had become a graveyard in slow expansion. By early 1942, German submarines pushed even farther west. Off the American coast, U-boats found targets sailing with lights on, unescorted and unprepared. This phase, known by the Germans as the Second Happy Time, marked the peak of submarine success. Sinking soared. Allied command reports grew increasingly grim. The balance of the war appeared to tilt beneath the waves, and the sense of urgency sharpened within British naval headquarters. Something fundamental had to change, not in equipment alone, but in how the war at sea was fought. It was within this environment of mounting losses and strategic desperation that British naval thinkers began to question long-held assumptions. Escorting convoys, they realized, was not enough. Protecting ships without destroying the hunters left the initiative in enemy hands. The Atlantic demanded a new approach, one that would reverse the roles of predator and prey. From this pressure, a quiet revolution in anti-submarine warfare began to take shape, preparing the ground for a single ship and a single commander who would embody that shift. The turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic did not arrive with a single invention or a sudden surge in shipbuilding. It emerged slowly, through analysis, frustration, and hard-earned lessons written in sinking reports. By mid-1942, British Naval Command accepted a painful truth: escorting convoys defensively, then breaking off contact to remain close to merchant ships, allowed U-boats to survive, regroup, and strike again. Submarines were not being defeated. They were merely being discouraged. And discouragement was not enough to win a war measured in tonnage and endurance. In response, the Royal Navy began restructuring how it fought beneath the waves. New escort formations were created, no longer tied permanently to convoys. These were support groups, mobile, aggressive units designed to hunt submarines once contact was made. Unlike traditional escorts, support groups could abandon a convoy temporarily, pursue a U-boat for hours or even days, and destroy it outright. This shift in doctrine marked a profound change in mindset. The ocean was no longer something to guard passively. It was terrain to be dominated. Technological advances supported this evolving philosophy. Sonar systems improved incrementally, becoming more reliable in rough seas and better at maintaining contact during an attack. High-frequency direction finding, known as HF/DF or HFDUF, allowed Allied ships to locate U-boats by intercepting their radio transmissions to command headquarters. Radar sets grew smaller and more effective, capable of detecting a submarine's conning tower at night or in poor weather. Most importantly, new weapons entered service. Ahead-throwing anti-submarine mortars like Hedgehog allowed ships to attack without losing sonar contact, reducing the blind moment that submarines had long exploited to escape. Yet technology alone could not solve the problem. Machines required doctrine, and doctrine required leadership. The Royal Navy needed officers willing to abandon caution and embrace relentless pursuit. It needed commanders who understood that anti-submarine warfare was not a single attack, but a process of pressure, mental as much as physical. One such officer had already been arguing this case long before it became official policy. Captain Frederick John Walker was not a traditional destroyer hero. He had spent much of his career in staff roles and training positions, studying submarine tactics and teaching others how to counter them. He believed that U-boats could be broken not only by explosives, but by exhaustion. His idea was simple and radical: never let a submarine rest. Maintain contact. Attack repeatedly. Force the crew to remain submerged until their batteries drained, their air grew foul, and their judgment collapsed. Only then would destruction be inevitable. When Walker was given command of the escort group centered on the sloop HMS Starling in 1942, his theories finally met opportunity. Starling was not a large ship. She lacked the speed of a destroyer and the prestige of a capital vessel. But she was well-equipped, well-handled, and purpose-built for escort duty. More importantly, she became the core of the second support group, a formation designed explicitly to apply Walker's aggressive philosophy at sea. Under Walker's command, training became relentless. Crews drilled continuously in sonar tracking, coordinated attacks, and night operations. Mistakes were analyzed in detail. Successes were dissected and refined. Walker demanded precision, but he also fostered confidence. His men understood that they were not simply protecting ships, they were changing the nature of the fight. Each patrol became an experiment in pressure, persistence, and control of the underwater battle space. As 1943 approached, the pieces were finally in place. Allied industry was producing more escorts. Aircraft coverage extended farther into the Atlantic. Intelligence improved. But at the heart of this transformation stood a single ship and a commander who refused to let the enemy disappear back into the depths. The Atlantic, long a hunting ground for German submarines, was about to become something far more dangerous for those who once ruled it. The first angle through which this story must be understood is human, because anti-submarine warfare was fought not by abstractions, but by men locked in long contests of nerve. Life aboard HMS Starling revolved around endurance. Patrols lasted weeks. Sleep came in fragments. The North Atlantic punished the body constantly, soaking clothing, numbing hands, and turning decks into frozen iron. Yet under Captain Walker, fatigue was not allowed to become indifference. Every contact mattered. Every sonar return was treated as real until proven otherwise. The crew learned that vigilance was not a burst of attention, but a sustained state of readiness that stretched hour after hour. Walker himself set the tone. He was known for his intensity, his impatience with routine, and his absolute focus on the enemy beneath the water. He walked the decks at all hours, observed exercises personally, and questioned operators about the smallest details of their readings. But he was not distant. He explained his reasoning. He shared his expectations. His crew understood not only what they were doing, but why. This clarity created trust. And trust created cohesion in conditions where morale often collapsed. On Starling, the hunt was collective, not abstract. The enemy was present, immediate, and personal. The second angle is tactical, and here Walker's influence was transformative. Traditional escort doctrine emphasized protecting the convoy at all costs, even if it meant abandoning a promising contact. Walker rejected this logic. In his view, a submarine that survived would simply attack again. The real protection of shipping came from destruction, not deterrence. His group practiced coordinated attacks involving multiple ships, maintaining sonar contact continuously while rotating attackers. This denied the submarine the chance to slip away during reloads or course changes. One of Walker's most effective methods was the creeping attack. In this tactic, one ship maintained sonar contact at slow speed, feeding precise bearings to a second vessel that approached silently. The attacking ship would then release depth charges or forward-thrown weapons with minimal warning. The submarine crew, often unaware of the attacker's exact position, had little time to maneuver. The ocean, once a place of concealment, became a narrowing trap defined by sound and pressure. Equally important was Walker's insistence on persistence. If a submarine was detected, Starling and her companions would remain on station for as long as necessary. Hours turned into days. Attacks were repeated, adjusted, and refined. Submarines were forced deeper, their batteries drained, their internal conditions deteriorating rapidly. Even when no immediate kill was achieved, the pressure accumulated. Crews grew exhausted. Mistakes multiplied. Eventually, the submarine either surfaced or succumbed to the relentless pounding. These human and tactical elements fed directly into one another. The crew's confidence enabled sustained pursuit, and sustained pursuit validated Walker's doctrine. The Atlantic was no longer a place where submarines could disengage at will. For the first time, German commanders began to report something new in their logs: fear not of sudden attack, but of never being left alone. That shift, subtle at first, would soon reshape the underwater war entirely. The technological angle of this transformation reveals why Walker's methods succeeded where earlier efforts failed. By 1943, HMS Starling and the Second Support Group operated at the intersection of maturing technology and disciplined doctrine. Sonar, still imperfect, had become reliable enough to support long-term tracking rather than brief contact. Operators learned to interpret faint returns, changes in echo strength, and subtle shifts in bearing. These were not mechanical readings alone, but skills sharpened by repetition and trust between men and machines. Technology no longer replaced judgment, it amplified it. Radar extended this advantage above the surface. U-boats, once safe to surface at night and recharge batteries, now risked sudden detection. Even a brief exposure of the conning tower could trigger an attack. HF/DF further eroded the submarine's greatest strength, invisibility. Each radio transmission, once essential for coordination and reporting, became a liability. Support groups could race toward an intercepted signal, arriving before the U-boat realized it had been found. The Atlantic shrank under this invisible web of detection, leaving fewer places to hide. New weapons completed the system. Hedgehog and later Squid allowed escorts to strike without breaking sonar contact, eliminating the moment of uncertainty that submarines had long exploited. Unlike depth charges, which exploded at preset depths, these weapons detonated only on contact. A miss meant silence. A hit meant destruction. For crews aboard Starling, this clarity mattered. It reduced doubt. It reinforced discipline. Each attack became a precise act rather than an educated guess. From the enemy's perspective, the effect was devastating. German U-boat crews began to describe Allied ships that would not disengage, that circled endlessly, that attacked again and again without pause. The psychological toll was severe. Submarines were designed for stealth and surprise, not prolonged pursuit. Air grew stale. Carbon dioxide levels rose. Men became lightheaded, irritable, and prone to error. Sleep was impossible. Every sound carried threat. The pressure was constant, and it was intentional. This erosion of morale had strategic consequences. U-boat commanders grew more cautious, breaking off attacks earlier or avoiding convoys entirely. Donitz himself noted the rising loss rates with alarm. The balance between hunter and hunted was reversing, not because submarines were suddenly obsolete, but because their operating environment had been fundamentally altered. The ocean was no longer permissive. It was hostile. There was also a moral dimension to this shift. Walker's doctrine left little room for escape. Once contact was made, the pursuit continued until resolution. This raised uncomfortable questions even among Allied officers. Yet the calculus of total war allowed little ambiguity. Each submarine destroyed represented dozens of merchant ships saved and thousands of lives spared. The relentless nature of the hunt was not cruelty for its own sake, but a response to years of unchecked destruction. By late 1943, the cumulative effect of these angles, human endurance, tactical innovation, technological integration, and psychological pressure, had set the stage for confrontation. The Atlantic was primed for decisive moments where theory would be tested against reality, and where the fate of entire patrols would hinge on hours of sound, steel, and resolve beneath the waves. The decisive phase began not with a single battle, but with a pattern of encounters that revealed how completely the balance at sea had shifted. In early 1944, the second support group, with HMS Starling at its core, operated in the western approaches and the Bay of Biscay, waters once dominated by German submarines entering and leaving their Atlantic patrol areas. These routes were vital to the U-boat campaign. Every submarine bound for the open ocean had to pass through them. Walker understood that if these choke points could be turned into killing grounds, the entire German effort would bleed out before it even reached the convoy lanes. Contact reports became more frequent. HF/DF bearings, radar sightings, and sonar detections blended into a continuous operational picture. Starling and her accompanying escorts no longer reacted to isolated threats, they anticipated them. When a U-boat transmitted, the support group closed in immediately. When sonar contact was gained, the pursuit did not loosen. Walker insisted on maintaining pressure through coordinated attacks, rotating ships to preserve sonar contact while others maneuvered into striking positions. Time ceased to matter. Only outcome remained. One of the most intense sequences unfolded over multiple days, as Starling's group hunted successive submarines attempting to break through into the Atlantic. In several engagements, U-boats were detected shortly after submerging, forced deep by initial attacks, and then held there relentlessly. Depth charges and ahead-thrown weapons hammered the water in calculated patterns. Between attacks, sonar operators listened intently, tracking every movement, every desperate turn. The ocean became a closed system, with no safe layer, no quiet depth. For the men inside the submarines, the experience was harrowing. Batteries drained rapidly under sustained evasion. Internal temperatures climbed. Air quality deteriorated. Condensation dripped from steel surfaces, mixing with oil and sweat. Commanders faced impossible choices: remain submerged and risk suffocation, or surface under the guns of waiting escorts. Walker's doctrine forced this decision deliberately. He did not seek quick kills. He sought inevitability. In several cases, submarines attempted to escape by running silent, settling on the seabed, or changing depth repeatedly to confuse sonar. Starling's crew adapted in real time. Attacks were adjusted. Patterns shifted. False assumptions were discarded. Each encounter refined the next. The support group functioned as a learning organism, absorbing experience and applying it immediately. This adaptability, more than any single weapon, defined the turning point. By the time confirmed explosions signaled the destruction of enemy submarines, the significance extended beyond the wreckage below. Each kill represented not just a tactical success, but proof that the new method worked under combat conditions. Reports filtered back to Naval Command. Loss rates were analyzed. The numbers told a clear story. The Atlantic was no longer a place where German submarines could operate with confidence. Yet the most critical tests were still unfolding as the hunt intensified and the margin for error narrowed even further. The culmination of this campaign arrived in a series of tightly linked engagements that left little doubt about the fate of the German U-boat arm. In the opening weeks of 1944, HMS Starling and the Second Support Group achieved an unprecedented concentration of successes. Submarines were detected, pursued, and destroyed in rapid succession, often within the same patrol cycle. The ocean that once absorbed losses quietly now revealed patterns of collapse. German boats were not simply being sunk, they were being intercepted before they could influence the wider battle at all. One of the most striking features of these encounters was their duration. Hunts lasted 20, 30, sometimes 40 hours without pause. Starling's engines ran continuously. Crews rotated through stations, exhausted but unyielding. Sonar contact was passed seamlessly between ships as they maneuvered to maintain pressure. Depth charge attacks were no longer singular events, but components of a sustained process designed to break both machine and crew. When explosions finally ruptured hulls or forced submarines to the surface, the outcome felt less like surprise and more like conclusion. In several documented cases, U-boats surfaced under extreme duress, damaged and unable to dive. Gunfire followed quickly. Survivors were recovered when possible, their condition offering grim confirmation of what prolonged pursuit had done. Interrogations later revealed the psychological devastation of these hunts. Commanders spoke of hopelessness, of the sense that escape had become mathematically impossible. The Atlantic, once defined by open space, had become claustrophobic. The strategic impact was immediate. German command records show rising alarm as loss reports accumulated. Boats were being lost faster than they could be replaced, and crews with valuable experience were vanishing with them. Donitz was forced to reconsider deployment patterns, pulling submarines back from key areas and delaying patrols. The initiative, so long held by the U-boat arm, slipped away almost unnoticed, buried beneath tonnage tables and casualty figures. For the Allies, the change was just as profound. Convoy losses dropped sharply. Merchant ships crossed the Atlantic with increasing confidence. The flow of men and material to Britain and, eventually, to the invasion forces assembling for Normandy stabilized. What had once been the most precarious element of the war effort became a foundation of strength. This transformation did not hinge on a single dramatic explosion or a famous battle name. It emerged from repetition, discipline, and the refusal to let the enemy disengage. At the center of it all, HMS Starling embodied a new reality of naval warfare. She did not dominate by size or speed, but by persistence. The turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic was not a moment of spectacle, but a grinding process that ended one submarine at a time. As the echoes of those final detonations faded, the consequences spread outward across oceans and continents, reshaping the remainder of the war. The immediate aftermath of the Second Support Group's campaign revealed a stark shift in the mathematics of war at sea. German U-boat losses climbed to levels that could not be sustained. Patrol areas once considered viable became lethal. Routes through the Bay of Biscay, previously essential gateways to the Atlantic, turned into corridors of attrition. Allied records documented the steady reduction in successful U-boat attacks, while German logs reflected growing caution, aborted patrols, and mounting frustration. The ocean had not changed, but the balance of control within it had. Statistical reports from early 1944 tell a clear story. Sinkings of Allied merchant vessels fell dramatically compared to the peak years of 1941 and 1942. Convoys arrived intact more often than not. When attacks did occur, submarines faced immediate and aggressive responses. The margin for error had vanished. Each transmission risked detection. Each dive risked prolonged pursuit. The German strategy, built on stealth and initiative, now functioned under constant constraint. Within the Royal Navy, the success of HMS Starling and Captain Walker validated years of doctrinal debate. Support groups were no longer experimental. They became standard. Training manuals incorporated Walker's principles of continuous contact and coordinated attack. Anti-submarine warfare evolved from a defensive necessity into an offensive campaign with clear objectives and measurable outcomes. The emphasis shifted from protecting ships in the moment to eliminating threats before they could act. For German command, the psychological impact was as damaging as the physical losses. Experienced crews were irreplaceable, and their disappearance weakened the force disproportionately. Newer crews, rushed through training, entered an environment far more hostile than the one their predecessors had faced. Confidence eroded. Reports from returning submarines spoke of Allied ships that refused to disengage, of hunts that seemed endless. The sense of mastery that once defined the U-boat arm dissolved into apprehension. On the Allied side, confidence grew quietly. Merchant sailors noticed the difference first. The long nights of burning ships and sudden explosions became less frequent. Escort crews, once accustomed to frustration, began to expect results. The Atlantic no longer felt like a gamble weighted against them. This change in morale, subtle but cumulative, reinforced the material advantages already taking shape through industrial output and expanded air cover. Yet even as success became evident, there was no pause in operations. Starling and her sister ships continued to patrol, continued to hunt, continued to apply pressure. The war beneath the waves did not end with a declaration of victory. It ended through exhaustion, of crews, of machines, of doctrine that could no longer adapt. And as the Atlantic settled into this new reality, the long-term consequences of one ship's methods were only beginning to unfold. As the months passed, the legacy of HMS Starling extended beyond operational reports and tonnage figures. The methods refined under Captain Walker became embedded in Allied naval culture, shaping how anti-submarine warfare would be taught, practiced, and understood for decades. Relentless pursuit, coordinated attacks, and the fusion of technology with disciplined crews were no longer innovations. They were doctrine. The Atlantic had become a proving ground whose lessons would outlast the war itself. Captain Frederick John Walker did not live to see the final victory in Europe. The strain of continuous operations and years of intense pressure took a severe toll on his health. In July 1944, only weeks after Allied forces landed in Normandy, Walker died of a cerebral hemorrhage. He was 48 years old. His death passed quietly compared to the explosions he had orchestrated at sea, yet within the Royal Navy it was understood as the loss of a figure who had fundamentally altered the course of the naval war. HMS Starling continued to serve, her reputation firmly established. She was credited with an extraordinary number of confirmed submarine destructions, more than any other Allied escort vessel. But her true significance lay not in statistics alone. She represented a shift in mindset, a refusal to accept stalemate, a belief that persistence could overcome even an enemy designed for concealment. Other ships adopted her methods. Other commanders embraced her logic. The Atlantic campaign became less about reacting to threats and more about denying their existence altogether. For Germany, the consequences were irreversible. By late 1944, the U-boat arm was largely neutralized as a strategic force. Submarines still put to sea, but their impact was marginal. Technological countermeasures, improved Allied coordination, and overwhelming numbers combined to close the ocean against them. The once feared Wolfpacks became isolated units struggling for survival in an environment that punished every mistake. In the broader war effort, this transformation had profound implications. Secure Atlantic supply lines enabled the buildup of Allied forces in Britain, sustained the Soviet Union through Arctic convoys, and supported operations across multiple theaters. The success of amphibious landings, the movement of armor and fuel, and the tempo of Allied advances all rested on control of the sea. What had been uncertain in 1942 was taken for granted by 1944. As the war drew toward its conclusion, the Atlantic faded from headlines, its battles overshadowed by the liberation of cities and the collapse of armies. Yet the ocean had decided much of what followed. Beneath its surface, doctrines were tested, broken, and remade. And among the ships that sailed those waters, one stood as a symbol of how persistence, guided by clear purpose, could turn even the most hostile environment into a place of control rather than fear. The Battle of the Atlantic was never won in a single moment of triumph. It was won through accumulation of small decisions, repeated actions, and unbroken resolve. HMS Starling did not change the war by existing. She changed it by refusing to let the enemy disappear. In a conflict defined by distance and uncertainty, her greatest weapon was persistence, applied patiently and without illusion. What unfolded beneath the waves was not simply a contest of machines, but a confrontation between ideas. One side relied on stealth, initiative, and calculated risk. The other learned to answer those qualities with endurance, coordination, and pressure that never eased. When those approaches collided, the ocean itself became an instrument of decision, transmitting sound, fatigue, and inevitability across steel hulls and human nerves. The legacy of this struggle extends far beyond the Second World War. Modern anti-submarine warfare still reflects the principles forged in those cold waters: continuous tracking, layered detection, and the understanding that psychological strain can be as decisive as physical damage. Technology has advanced, but the underlying logic remains unchanged. Control of the sea is achieved not by momentary dominance, but by sustained denial of freedom to the adversary. For the men who served aboard Starling, the war was measured in watches stood, echoes heard, and days without rest. Their experience reminds us that history often turns on endurance rather than spectacle. The Atlantic did not roar its decision. It absorbed it, slowly and relentlessly, until one side could no longer remain submerged. When the war ended, the sea returned to silence. But the lessons remained, etched into doctrine and memory. One British ship did not merely defeat submarines. It transformed an ocean from a hunting ground into a barrier, and in doing so, helped ensure that the flow of men and material, and ultimately the course of history, could not be stopped.